I'm Frank Garza, and welcome to Here and Abroad, a podcast that follows the U.S. men's national team and their player pool across Europe, MLS, or wherever else they play their club football. On today's show, we're going to discuss the two friendlies that the USMNT just completed. They beat Uzbekistan 3-0 on Saturday and Oman 4-0 on Tuesday. To help me break down their performance, I've invited Kevin Baxter to join the show. Kevin writes about soccer and other things for the Los Angeles Times, where he has worked for 27 years. He has covered 7 World Cups, 4 Olympic Games, 6 World Series, and a Super Bowl, and has contributed to 3 Pulitzer Prize-winning series at the Times and Miami Herald. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Hey, Frank. Thanks for having me. It's nice to greet the Berhalter 2.0 here.
Yes. Berhalter 2.0 has officially began with this September window. We got USMNT got 2 wins in these friendlies, and I'm just curious, let's start there. What were your major takeaways from these matches?
Well, my major takeaway is where the U.S. needs to schedule more challenging opponents. Oman is ranked 79th in the world. Uzbekistan is 85th. Although Uzbekistan did give Mexico a real battle in its Tuesday game. But I'm not sure what can be learned from playing games like this, especially since the U.S. under Berhalter has always tended to play down to the competition. When you look at it, in the World Cup, they needed 1 goal to beat Iran 1-0, yet they played great against England in the previous game. So it's a team that seems to play down to its competition, and then you go out and schedule games against the 85th team in the world. So I don't know what you learned from that. I understand it's difficult right now to find good opponents. South America's in their qualifying for the World Cup, and the European teams are in Euro qualifying. But again, speaking of Mexico, they managed to schedule a game against Australia. I think if the U.S. really wants to find out where they are, they need to play tougher games.
Yeah, you mentioned Mexico playing Uzbekistan. While we were playing Oman, they tied 3-3. So maybe that Uzbekistan doesn't Uzbekistan match that a lot of people were pretty fired up about and complaining about the U.S.'s performance. Maybe it doesn't look as bad, but yeah, we'll definitely get some higher quality opponents, in that October window with Germany and Ghana.
Yeah, Germany just beat France, so I think we'll learn a lot in that game.
Right. So let me ask you a few specific things about these 2 matches that I noticed. The first one is there was a couple of newer guys that got a lot of playing time in Christopher Lund and Malik Tillman. So Christopher Lund, he got his first cap, his first start. Malik Tillman got his first start against Oman. What'd you make of those 2 guys? Because we haven't seen a lot of them, especially with this first team, and they got a lot of playing time. What'd you make of their performance?
Well, one thing I made of it is that second game, the U.S. started 5 players who had spent the majority of their life in Europe. Des Tillman, Lund, Musa, and Balogun. Greg Berhalter, since he started, has brought in over 3 dozen players who are dual nationals. That is, when you talk about the name of the show, following the U.S. national team at home and abroad, this national team is from abroad now. It just shows, I think, that they're casting the net much, much wider than they had in the past. And that's a good thing. If you have a player who's dual national, can get a U.S. passport, and he's playing in Europe, why not go after and try to bring him into the fold? And I think that's been a great thing. As far as how they played, I don't think they were all that good. I think Tillman and Lund both struggled a little bit. And that's to be expected. They in their first camps, really, playing their first games, getting to know some new teammates. I think that's what you're supposed to be doing right now. 3 years out from the World Cup. You're supposed to be bringing these guys in, introducing them to the teammates, finding out what you have. Some of these guys will be back. Like we said, 36 players that Berhalter has brought in from the dual nationals. They're not all still here. And so that's what you're supposed to be finding out at this time. Both players are talented. Both players are playing in big leagues in Europe. Both players have a lot to give. They just need to get a little more acclimated. And I think that beginning that process, that when you go back to the schedule again, Uzbekistan and Oman, these are the games where you want to test those players out. You don't want them necessarily playing against Germany or England.
Yeah, that is one of Berhalter's biggest challenges. I think in these next couple of years is building more depth and identifying more players. And that left back position where Lund played is definitely one of those. So I was happy that he gave him the start. I thought Lund looked pretty solid, for considering it was his debut. I thought he looked comfortable on the ball. He seemed to be thrilled to be out there. Every time the U.S. scored a goal when he was on the field, he was like one of the first people to congratulate. So I'd like to see more of him. He didn't blow me away, his performance, but I thought he looked pretty solid, out there.
You know what I thought was interesting is again looking at the competition, and I hate to keep going back to that, but it's that really my takeaway. I mean, yes, they outscored the two teams 7-0. They won both games comfortably, but they didn't look impressive. Uzbekistan actually outshot the U.S. and I thought Matt Turner had a great game, and I liked the fact that Matt Turner got a little vocal and a little emotional with some of his teammates. You look at Matt Turner, I always see this guy that's sort of cool and calm, and you almost wonder sometimes whether he's in the game. And to see him get a little fired up, I thought that was a really good sign. But Uzbekistan pushed the game, and they tested the U.S. back line, and I don't think the U.S. back line looked all that great in that first game, which is, why Turner got a little upset. The second game, Oman seemed to just sit back, and they only had, I think, 3 shots on the night, maybe 1 on goal. They really didn't test that defense at all. And that's, again, when you look at these friendlies and what you're trying to accomplish, that's certainly not the way the U.S. were hoping their opponents would play. That game was just too easy. And again, going back to your first question, what did we learn? The second game especially, I think we learned that there's some talent up. Ricardo Pepi with the goal. He now has 6 goals in his last 6 games. He has 4 goals off the bench this calendar year. First player to do that since Bobby Wood in 2015. So that's all to the good. And again, Balogun scored again, and I think we found a number 9, maybe 2 number 9s, which the U.S. has long lacked. I'd like to see a lot more Balogun with Christian Pulisic. I think that is a pairing that is just going to get better and better and better. But again, Oman just made it too easy for them. So, were they good goals? Yeah, but would they score those goals against France or Germany? I don't know.
I thought Ricardo Pepi's goal was particularly impressive because I thought he took a very minimal chance and very quickly created it into a goal. And I don't see a lot of players doing that. So I love to see Ricardo Pepi, scoring so many goals. Do you think he's legitimately challenging Balogun for that starting number 9 spot, or is that firmly in Balogun's hands?
I think right now just the pedigree is firmly in Balogun's hands, and again, I think that pairing with him and Pulisic, the pedigree is a big part of that, and I say that a little bit from experience because covering the LA Galaxy here in Los Angeles, I've seen a lot of players come through that are very talented. But when the best pairing the Galaxy have ever had was Donovan and Robbie Keane. And they both had that pedigree of being, top players. Not that Pepe is not a top player, but I think Pulisic and Balogun coming from top European leagues, they just seemed feeling that they're going to have a little bit more of a chemistry together. There's nothing wrong with Pepe coming off the bench, though. He's proved to be very effective coming off the bench. And you talk about depth. The last thing you want is to say take your striker out at 65 minutes and then have the other team know that you're not going to be dangerous. I mean, you take a tired Balogun off and bring on a fresh Pepe, all of a sudden your attack might be even better. And that's something that I think you really hit on something. I mean, the bench needs to be strong. There needs to be some options off the bench at every position. And the one, Balogun's goal was sort of a, not a garbage goal, but it was one of those goals where the ball was ricocheting around the box. It didn't come to him. He wasn't the target on that play, and he scored anyways. And that's a gritty kind of goal and a poacher kind of goal. And the U.S. typically does not score a lot of those. And I think when the ball pings around the box, to have a guy that's going to be there to collect it, that is a big step forward too. That's something the U.S. hasn't traditionally had.
Okay, you mentioned Greg Berhalter 2.0 at the beginning, and I want to move there next. So what do we learn about Greg Berhalter 2.0 from these friendlies in terms of is he going to do anything different? How is he going to do things? What were your takeaways there?
Well, I think we're getting the same Greg Berhalter, right? I mean, I think Greg's a very conservative guy. He was a defender, and for all the stuff that he did in Columbus and in Europe, where he tried to really, and the beginning of his stint with the national team, when he really tried to have a sort of a pushing 4-3-3 attacking-minded team. At heart, he's a conservative defensive guy, and I think that hasn't changed. One of the things that I'm a big Berhalter guy, first of all, and I know it's very controversial out there, in the U.S. national team fandom, to say the least, that Berhalter's back. I'm a Berhalter guy. Look, the team, he's the winningest coach as far as winning percentage goes of any U.S. national team coach that's coached more than 5 games. So he's been successful. You may not like how he wins, and I get that because it is in my mind, it's a very conservative approach. So you may not like the style of soccer they play, but they win, okay, under Berhalter. The bigger takeaway for me are the bigger selling point with Berhalter is the players want him. The players have all spoken to a man. The only person that I've spoken to on the team that hasn't spoken up, fervently in support of Greg is Kellen Acosta. And he didn't say anything bad about Greg. He just said, I don't want to answer that question. So everybody else seems to be in Greg's corner. You want guys to want to play for their coach. You want them to be simpatico, on the same page. And the core of the team, Weston McKennie, Christian Pulisic, Tyler Adams, they all want to play for Greg. Greg's the guy that brought them along. And so that's good. If that's who they want to play for, then that's good. The one thing that Berhalter still needs to do, and I don't know why he hasn't done it, because it's going to be a distraction until he does. He needs to take care of that, elephant in the room, and he needs to sit down and talk with Gio Reyna. He needs to hash that out. They need to make sure they get on the same page. I put 95% of the blame for that whole thing on the Reyna family, but that doesn't matter. It's still a distraction. Gio Reyna is a quality player. He's young. He's going to be in the national team pool for a long time, whether Berhalter is the coach or not. Right now, Berhalter is the coach, and he needs to make sure that everybody's on the same page, and that means getting Gio Reyna on the same page. So that's the big piece of unfinished business, and Greg keeps saying, he's going to do it, he's going to do it. Well, I think Reyna probably is going to be called into that October camp if he is healthy, and he's apparently training again. So if he's going to be on that October camp, you don't want to do it then. That's a distraction when you got a game against Germany coming up. You need to do it now.
Yeah. That's seeing what happens between now and that October camp with Gio Reyna is going to be really interesting. More on that a little bit later, because I definitely want to talk about that. You mentioned this 4-3-3 that Greg Berhalter wants to play. I think that a lot of people had assumed in watching the U.S. and the Nations League, finals, when they looked so good with Reyna as that 10 playing in more of like 4-2-3-1, that maybe that was the future for the U.S. men's national team. But Greg doesn't seem to be having any of it. He seems to be sticking to this 4-3-3, and maybe he changes his mind when Gio comes back. But what's your thoughts on that? Do you see him changing from the 4-3-3 at all?
He might be dragged kicking and screaming into making that change, but I agree with you. I think that's a very effective formation for them, especially if Balogun, emerges, or Pepe, either one, emerges as that real target striker. Why share the room up front if you decide you have one guy that's going to be your striker, and Pulisic and Reyna and those guys are going to be the playmakers? Why not play to your strength? And just the way this U.S. team comes together, I think it looks much more like as you said, a 4-2-3-1. And I think you need to mold your formation and mold your attack and your strategy to the players you have. You can't just say, Barcelona plays a 4-3-3 and then they're good, we're going to do it. Well, you might not have the players to do that. One more thing about Berhalter that I think gets lost in this team when you look at the core of this team again is, remember, Dave Sarachan really doesn't get the credit he deserves for what he did in his 1 year as interim coach and putting this team together. He gave a record 23 players a chance with the national team, including McKennie, Tyler Adams, Jack Steffen, Anthony Robinson. A lot of the guys that are the core of this team were introduced to the national team, came into the pool, got their feet wet under Dave Sarachan. That's the team that Berhalter inherited. And I think before we move on and get too much into Greg Berhalter, we need to recognize that Dave Sarachan had a lot to do with this too, and I don't think gets the credit he deserves for that.
Yeah. He did kind of start that turnover of the player pool. I remember that when he was calling in all these guys that I had never seen before that were like teenagers, and a lot of those guys have rose up through the ranks and are still with the team today. So that's a good point. Let's talk about we've talked about some of the individual player performances that we noticed during these matches. If you had to pick out one or two players that you think had a really good performance, who are the players that come to mind?
Well, I know he only played one game, but Matt Turner I thought was really good. And I've always kind of looked at Matt Turner. He's a terrific player, but I've always kind of looked at him as someone that's kind of a placeholder until Jack Steffen gets healthy and comes along and takes the job back. That's clearly not going to happen anymore. After his World Cup, after his performance, and now rising up, in the European game, Matt Turner, he's the starter now. He's got the job. I don't know what I was hoping for, but again, the way he played in that game, the way he is starting to exert himself as a leader, I think Matt Turner has really emerged as a force for this team, and he's young enough that he's going to be there certainly through the next World Cup. So I liked him. Ricardo Pepe, not complaining, coming off the bench, scoring goals. Not he definitely argue and create a fuss over how he should be starting because he's producing. Maybe he's found a niche, and there's nothing wrong with being a guy who comes off the bench and changes games. That's an important thing to have. Should he be starting? Could he be starting? Yeah. I mean, his production shows that, but he's content coming off the bench, scoring, changing games. That's great. I think if he continues to embrace that role, I think Ricardo Pepe maybe took a big step forward. And then I just continue to like seeing the relationship and the chemistry develop between Balogun and Pulisic, as we've said a couple times. Balogun is still very new to the team and very new to some of these players. And the future just looks really bright if what we're seeing now is just the start. Maybe it doesn't improve, and that's fine because it's pretty good now. But imagine if it does begin to improve and the chemistry does start to get better. I thought he was very impressive. I guess the part that I wasn't so impressed with, I just don't see a lot of depth on the back line. I know they were missing Walker Zimmerman. Tim Ream, I don't think played that well. I think Miles Robinson regressed a little bit, without Walker Zimmerman again. The back line just did not impress me, especially against Uzbekistan where they got outshot, and then Oman didn't even test them, so we didn't get to see anything out of them.
Yeah, a couple players that stood out to me in a positive way was, first of all, Weston McKennie. We talk about Tyler Adams is going to be coming back from injury. Gio Reyna is going to be coming back. And there's talk of one of these midfielders is going to get kind of left out of the starting lineup. And who's that going to be? Is it going to be McKennie? Is it going to be Musa? McKennie emerged to me as a guy you can't take out of the lineup from this match. He was so dynamic. His passing was so good. And I think he's just a playmaker. He loves being out there for the U.S. men's national team. And I see him, he's a lot more dynamic for the U.S. men's national team than when I watch him at Juventus. So I enjoyed watching him in these two matches. And then you mentioned Matt Turner. I thought Ethan Horvath had a great game against Oman. I know he didn't get a lot of shots on goal, but the way he handled the ball and distributed the ball, I was really impressed with. When he would get the ball, he would get it out to somebody really quickly. And that's a hang-up I've seen with Sean Johnson in the past before, is that when he gets the ball, it's kind of too slow. So I was impressed with Ethan Horvath.
The good thing about Horvath is good decision-making. A guy getting put in that spotlight, and yes, it wasn't a World Cup final, but, he doesn't play a lot for the national team, so he was clearly trying to impress. And a lot of times guys get very conservative when they're doing that. I thought really good decision making. And you're right about McKennie. McKennie strikes me as a guy who is a very emotional player. He'll get fired up. Sometimes he'll take himself out of games by being too emotional, too fired up. So if you can sort of dial down the emotion and get him playing within himself, he just has a lot to give. And sometimes the emotion helps, but it's when it bubbles over that he gets into a little bit of a problem and tries to do too much. And I think we saw that in the World Cup occasionally. I think you're right about that midfield being loaded. And I think Musa is the guy that goes to the bench. And again, Musa's a great player. He could be and should be starting, but there's just not enough. They only have three midfielders. So if you have Musa and Pepe on the bench ready to come on in the 60th minute, 65th minute, how much better is this team? You talked about it at the start. The depth, it used to be if we could find 11 guys to put on the field, that was good. Now it's 16, 17 guys deserve to start. And so that just means when you make those changes, and Berhalter needs to learn, maybe that's the big thing that Berhalter needs to learn going forward, is he does have this depth now. How is he going to use it? How is he going to strategically use his substitutes when he needs to chase the game and when he needs to, run out the game?
Yeah. I think it's, that's one of the big issues I saw with the World Cup was it didn't seem to me that Berhalter trusted any midfielders beyond McKennie, Musa, and Adams. And those guys played so many minutes that I think they were pretty tired by the time that Netherlands match came. And so having four midfielders that are top notch playing, European football that you can rotate in some of these, like the Copa America coming up and the World Cup, that's going to be helpful. I know it kind of sucks for the person that gets left out in some of these 2-match windows. Maybe they're not going to get as much playing time, but all of those guys in the tournament setting, they're going to get their playing time, and that's going to help the team stay fresh when we get into those knockout rounds.
And you maybe made the mistake of bringing it up, the 4-2-3-1. So if we decide that Pulisic, Weston McKennie, and Tyler Adams are the three, right? Who are the two? If in the 4-2-3-1, Do you move Tyler Adams back and have him be a holding midfielder, maybe with Kellen Acosta? Who are your two holding midfielders?
Well, I see the 4-2-3-1, the one being Balogun. I see Pulisic and Weah on the wings, Reyna as that middle number 10 and the 3, and then the two holding midfielders. That's where I think it's going to be a tough call. I think I see it being McKennie and Adams, and then Musa's the one that kind of gets left out. But I don't know. It's a tough call.
No, and it's great talking through this, because then you just, if that's how you set up your midfield, and I forgot about Weah and obviously Reyna. Although Reyna, the problem in the World Cup was what role Reyna was going to fill, and Greg wanted to use him off the bench, and Gio didn't want to play that way. That's how he plays in Germany, and he's super successful. He rarely starts, and he's a game changer off the bench. You know what? Some guys are just, that's their role. They want to play 90 minutes, but sometimes their role is to come off the bench, and maybe Reyna should embrace that as he does in Germany with the national team. But back to the original point. So I do like, your two wingers and then having Reyna sort of in the middle as the playmaker. But then do you really want to have Tyler Adams and Weston McKennie that deep? Or maybe you push your two holding midfielders up. And this is the stuff.
Yeah.
This is the stuff that Berhalter's talking about, and that's why it's a good problem to have.
Yeah.
Your players are so talented that it makes it difficult to pick a formation where all of them are in their best role. If you, again, looking at the two wingers and Gio Reyna, man, that's the best three-person combination, right? But then there's no room for Weston McKennie and Tyler Adams, who have to be on the field. And so then if you play them as holding midfielders, they can do that. They're very good at that. But with this team, do you want them that far back defensively? Wouldn't you rather have them pushing the attack? So maybe you play a high line. Maybe you push forward. Those are the things that Berhalter has to think about. And again, being a coach who's I think his predilection is to be conservative, he's probably not going to roll the dice too much. It's a good problem to have, but it's a problem.
Yeah. You've touched on something that I can't figure out with that 4-2-3-1 how McKennie fits in best. I know the 4-2-3-1 takes advantage of Gio Reyna and some of his skills, but having McKennie as a holding, as one of the holding midfielders, I think takes away some of his strengths. I think he's far better when he's like in a true like box to box role, but we're going to have to see. I mean, I think that's a nice transition to the next thing I want to talk about, which is these October friendlies against Germany and Ghana. We're going to play Germany on October 14th and Ghana on October 17th. And, what happens with Gio Reyna, there's going to be some drama around this. There's going to be, okay, are they talking beforehand? Then if he comes into the camp, all eyes are going to be on him. Then there's going to be, okay, does Greg start Gio Reyna? And if he doesn't, then like the Twitterverse is just going to erupt and the anti-Berhalters are going to go crazy. I mean, what are you thinking looking ahead to this October window and how Gio Reyna is going to be implemented and what that window is going to look like?
Well, first of all, I would, if Greg Berhalter calls me, I would urge him to have this conversation now. Fly to Germany, sit down, talk with Gio Reyna, get it done. Because imagine Reyna shows up in camp in the first press conference. Greg, have you talked to Gio yet? No, I haven't. Oh my God, that's the rest of the month. That's all the conversation's going to be. So go get it done now, away from the spotlight. Have him come back. Have Greg come back, and then he does a press conference when they announce the roster. First question will be, have you talked to Gio? Yes, we had a nice talk. I met with him in Dortmund. We went out for coffee. It was great. Get that out of the way, first of all. Second of all, I think if he is called up, if he's healthy enough to be called up against Germany, that's kind of the best way to ease him in, because he's going to be very familiar with the German players. I think there's going to be a little familiarity there. I think that's going to help. As far as the Twitterverse lighting up, if he doesn't start, I don't know if he's going to start because of fitness concerns. And he's not game fit right now. Do you want him to go out and try to play 90 minutes against Germany with his history of injuries and everything else? So, Greg may have an out there like, look, yeah, I was going to start Gio, wink, wink, but, he's not fit. So all those could sort of work well, but Greg is going to have to get this Reyna thing out of the way soon. And, Reyna's a young player. He's also an emotional player. I do blame the family for a lot of this, but not so much Gio, because he's a guy who wants to play. He's a young player. He's a dynamic player. He knows he's good. He wants to play. What do you want him to say? No, that's okay. I'll sit on the bench. I mean, I think that might be the best role for him. But when he starts conceding that, then he loses a little bit of his edge. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. You want him to accept his role, but you also want him to want to play. So that's all a good thing. These two games, though, I think it's clearly going to be a much better test than Uzbekistan and Oman were. And is this the place to try out some formational variations? I don't know. Maybe I think probably the Uzbekistan Oman games were better for that, but Greg didn't have all his horses. So, you can't just say, oh, we're going to play Pepe. He's going to be Gio Reyna. No, Gio Reyna is a different player. You have to get Gio Reyna to play the Gio Reyna role and see if it works.
Yeah, my prediction, and maybe this is too early, is that Greg's going to roll with his 4-3-3, and Gio Reyna's not going to start. He's going to come off the bench, like you mentioned, and they'll have that out of like fitness and kind of getting him back into shape. But I just think that all the talk around that and how that's being handled is gonna really dominate that window, which is a little unfortunate because I think this is going to be the best test the USMNT has, I think, in 2023 is these two matches against high quality opponents. Let me ask you about the roster. When you look at the current roster, the people that came in for the September friendlies, is there anybody that you see that is going to get left off based on their performance and maybe replaced by some other guys? Or what are you thinking about that roster? Is it going to be most of the same, or do you expect too much turnover?
No, there'll be some turnover because guys are going to get healthy. I mean, Walker Zimmerman wasn't called in for this camp. I assume it was because he's been injured. Gio Reyna's coming in. He's got to replace somebody. Some of the guys that we talked about earlier who were getting sort of their first look, Tillman and Lund, I'd like to see them come back simply because it was a very small sample size, and we don't know what we have from those guys. So I think they need to come back. I think what Greg probably does is maybe leaves off some of the players that aren't necessarily in the picture going forward. Maybe Tim Ream doesn't come back in. I don't know about Miles Robinson. If Walker is healthy, does Miles Robinson then get left out? He's a guy that Greg knows a lot about. I mean, I think it'll be guys that Greg knows a lot about already, and he'll bring some of the young guys back in. But I mean, the core 11, the core 14, 15, I think Greg needs to continue to call those guys back in because he's bringing new guys into the fold, like, again, Balogun, and those guys need to have some reps and some chemistry with the players that Greg thinks are going to be the starters going forward. I mean, I think the temptation is to say, okay, what's our lineup going to look like when we open the 2026 World Cup? There's so much focus and pressure on that World Cup, and rightly so. I mean, this could be a game-changing moment for the U.S. national team and U.S. soccer. But what if we went back 4 years and looked at the starting lineup in the lineups Greg were using in friendlies in 2019 and said, here's the team we're going to have in Qatar? It wouldn't even be close. So Greg's got to look at it and said, in a real perfect world, this is my starting 11, but I don't know who's going to emerge. And that's a kind of a tough thing to do, to balance both of those, that these are the guys I want to see reps from, but I can't ignore these other guys. And you speak about Germany and Ghana, two really good opponents. I know Ghana has struggled a little bit lately, but they were a World Cup team. Germany just beat France, so these are good teams. The U.S. needs to be very cognizant of who it tries to schedule these friendlies around. And again, this window was a tough one with South American qualifying and Euro qualifying in Europe, but there's no World Cup qualifying this time. I know we're going to have Copa America here, but the U.S. needs to play top quality opponents because that's who it's going to face in the World Cup. And they need to get used to playing those kind of teams.
Yeah, Germany and Ghana, and they're two teams that the U.S. has a lot of World Cup experience playing against in various World Cups over the years. So that's going to be a lot of fun watching those two matches. Well, Kevin, this has been great. Before I let you go, two things. First of all, where can people go if they'd like to see some more of your work? And then, second, please just share any final thoughts you have about the U.S. men's national team or anything else.
Well, they can go to latimes.com on the web, and my Twitter handle is kbaxter11. Maybe not Twitter, I'm supposed to say X. On X, I'm at kbaxter11. This is an exciting time for the national team, both for the men's and the women's. And for the men, obviously, pointing to that 2026 World Cup. Hopefully, people will start talking about soccer. I was a little disappointed in the attendance of these two games, given where they were. The first one in St. Louis, which I know this was a big thing on social media. Is St. Louis really the sort of the crib of American soccer? And I think you can make that argument. So I was a little disappointed in that crowd. Maybe Germany and Ghana will bring out a bigger crowd, but then the U.S. women's team, too, after this poor World Cup performance, beginning to change its player pool around and developing new and younger players. This is a really exciting time to be involved with U.S. soccer. And it kind of feels like finally the sky's the limit. It's finally starting to pick up a little bit, and people are starting to pay attention.
All right, Kevin. Well, I will link to both of those things that you mentioned in the show notes so people can check for those links to see more of your work. Kevin, thanks again for joining the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And
thanks to everyone for listening to Here and Abroad. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with a fellow USMNT fan. I'm Frank Garza. You can follow me on Twitter/X at FrankGarza007, and I'll be back next week with a new episode.